I am so delighted to have Lee Ebersole today. Ending. Lee and I started out together way back in orientation in 801, and so it's been a great pleasure for me to continue working throughout this process, particularly to get to finish up the dissertation. Lee has 2 master's degrees from Maryland University and Wheeling Jesuit University for Education. He has a bachelor's degree in languages from Georgetown. He's currently the coordinator of federal programs and school improvement at Jefferson County Schools in West Virginia. Today, he is going to present or defend his dissertation titled Successfully Aging Out of Foster Care, a Constructivist Grounded Theory Study. So with that, Lee, tell us what you did and what you learned.
Well, first of all, and I realize we're a very small group, but what I thought is how I would open our conversation is just to reflect on something that Karen Cook used to always tell me, and that was always remember the order of operations. When in doubt, follow the order of operations. And in this instance, I would just begin sort of with the end in mind, and I would thank Dr. Brock and Dr. Getterman. They have really been like the dream committee. They always spoke to me in one voice. They actually gave me permission to do this work when I was somewhat weary at times, and I'm just very grateful that I had such a wonderful committee that allowed me to do this study and actually equipped me to it, so thank you for that. So, Successfully Aging Out of Foster Care, a Constructivist Grounded Theory Study. Youth in foster care upon exit confront considerable challenges. They are far more likely to experience homelessness, incarceration, pretty much any negative outcome that we can think of, they are among the most likely. In fact, when I initially designed the study, it was suggested by one of my colleagues that I would more likely find participants if I were to go to the local regional prison or if I were to go to the homeless shelter. So alas, given all of these difficulties and challenges that they face, and of course having endured significant trauma, both within birth families, but also through the experience of foster care, there's really very little literature about success. We know a lot about when it doesn't work. And then if you add to that my home state of West Virginia, which so happens to be the state in the Union where the most significant rate of placement into foster care exists among the 50, and that is because we are grappling with the opioid crisis in our rural communities. So we have the highest numbers of children per capita going into foster care in West Virginia because of the crisis. So again, I wanted to do something to help my friends in Appalachia, although I will say that both Dr. Brock and Dr. Getterman helped me narrow that context to focus specifically on West Virginia. Dr. Getterman really introduced me to this idea of constructivist grounded theory. That became my jam. I would say that Kathy Sharma's and her blue book, of course I've watched numerous of her videos, she is my guru. And again, it's mostly because of this idea of really sort of a critique. I like the idea, how do we understand systems and how they truly work for marginalized people? This idea of, again, creating a theoretical framework, but also getting to the point of social justice. So ultimately, how do we carve a path for these kids to successfully age out of foster care in West Virginia and promote social justice? So that's what the study's about. Again, as it says, the purpose was to explore the process that youth experienced in successfully transitioning to adulthood in West Virginia from foster care. You'll note that we were very specific to identify what is success. So the markers of success were having secured permanent housing and being sufficiently employed to be self-sustaining or to be enrolled in higher education on a full-time basis. So I have a variety of participants who did all of those things. Again, the research question, what theoretical framework explains how youth successfully age out of foster care in West Virginia? And again, I thank Dr. Getterman, who helped me really boil that down. It seems to be this very lengthy research question. Now, ironically, so the latest iteration of my aim has become somewhat elaborate, but the key idea is that this study aimed to develop or generate a theoretical framework explaining this successful transition from foster care. And I did indeed, I was able, based on these intensive interviews I did with participants who had aged successfully out of foster care, to generate a theory with 5 theoretical categories that I'll explain in detail later, that did generally cohere with the research literature that we read. And I give this example from Reedy and Arias Courtney. We read a lot of work in Courtney in this era, and Ahrens, that talked about how you have to have intentional strategies to mitigate against these considerable negative trajectories related to well-being for these young people. Again, and so it's very important to our work here at Creighton is that it's not just about theory, but it's applying theory to practice. So the application of a proposed solution that I'll share with you a little bit here, that it describes how we, in fact, help youth prepare for successful transition from foster care in West Virginia. Again, my literature review is very brief. It's all reduced down to 2 slides. My committee asked me to consolidate it. So again, it's important to remember that these markers of success are good for all people. Again, when we look at housing, housing does indeed contribute to our psychological health and well-being. It's important to have a place to call home. Obviously, employment is associated with psychological capital. Those of us who have work have more meaningful lives. And then obviously education at higher levels, those of us who earn more are more likely to enjoy healthier lifestyles and therefore contribute more to our community and to our families. Youth in foster care, however, are more prone to experience all of those things negatively. So when we talk about housing youth who age out of foster care, again, between 25 and 50% of them, according to the literature, do experience homelessness sufficient to meet the federal definition of homelessness. In terms of employment, while there are a variety of programs that support youth in foster care, they tend to focus on sort of interviewing techniques and job seeking rather than career development or job preparation. So overall, they're rather unsuccessful, according to our friends in Courtney. And again, Courtney is another name, Zworsky, Courtney, they regularly appear in the literature about youth in foster care. In terms of education, this is a very distressing point. Through the Chafee Act, which we can talk about a little bit later, a variety of supports, including financial aid, housing, counseling, are provided. For example, here in Nebraska, also in West Virginia, a child in foster care who successfully enrolls in college, is admitted to college, is provided absolutely free tuition. They're provided a housing allowance, all of these wonderful things through the Chafee Act. However, that doesn't increase graduation rates according to the literature. And they attribute that to something called effective attachment. Again, foster children generally do not trust adults who are there to help them, and so consequently that continues into the higher ed setting. And then finally, as one would understand, behavioral health is a major issue for anyone who's encountered the kind of trauma that our foster youth have encountered. So providing those supports is absolutely essential. I would share with you that the Annie Casey Foundation earlier this spring issued a report that was, it actually monetized outcomes for youth who transition from foster care if they've been successful. And they estimated that we would save upwards of $4 billion per cohort over the lifetime if we were to actually allow them to be successful across these categories. I must confess that Annie Casey added one additional category that I did not consider, perhaps you'll understand why, and it was actually teen parenting. And that's a very costly experience. And as you'll see, one of my participants was actually a teen parent. So the research design, as I explained, is constructivist grounded theory, again, promoting social justice. And the real key here for me is this idea, and I'll explain in detail why in just a second, but the idea of researching with, not on or about. That was very important to me as a researcher. Again, my participants all experienced these markers of success. They had all reached the age of legal majority in West Virginia, which is 18. I will share with you that the range was from 22 to 29. It was very important in this study that we work with that I work with young adults, so to have a sense of recency. So their reflections of their experiences would be more recent rather than someone like myself who would be a long time ago that I'd experienced this. And then I was assisted with recruitment by the Chief Executive Officer of the largest private child welfare agency in West Virginia. They have 6 regional offices, and she and her team regularly make referrals to me. And that allowed me to be sure that these people actually met the criteria, so they helped me evaluate them or pre-evaluate them to be included into the study. Here are the demographics of my participants. Again, you see the age range from 2 to 29. These are all pseudonyms. The lowest educational level was a high school diploma, and it was actually one of my participants who actually had a master's degree. You'll notice that the majority of them spent 5 years in foster care. One of them was in foster care for 13 years. A significant number for those unfamiliar with foster care is how many placements they had. Multiple placements, in many cases, the number of placements exceeding the number of years in foster care. All of my participants were in a significant relationship. However, 3 were single, 1 was divorced, 1 was married. There was only one man, that was Wyatt, and all of my participants identified as Caucasian. My data collection tool was, again, an interview protocol comprising 6 open-ended questions. It sort of began with what is your current life experience, and then we asked their opinion, thank you, Dr. Gettelman, about how would they actually advise the system if they were to suggest improvements. In addition, I did use this life history research sequence, and I created a timeline for all participants. Again, rigorous, I won't go through every single step, but basically I got a referral. I walked rigorously through these 10 steps for each participant, which concluded with my uploading not only the transcripts, that were of course prepared by rev.com, and I reviewed them, but I would then archive as well my observation timeline and my own reflections. I completed a weekly reflection, and I also did a reflection upon the conclusion of each interview with each participant. I did use the Max QDA program, which was a wonderful tool for me. It was great in terms of just seeing where the coding was going, but more importantly, it helped me focus on the language. It allowed the participants to tell the story rather than me. Again, in all, of course, social research ethical considerations are very important, but especially when working with such a marginalized population as young people who had experienced foster care. They're truly traumatized folk. So obviously, several safeguards had to be in place, obviously pseudonyms, confidentiality. I will confess that my IRB approval was exempt, so therefore they did not require written informed consent. However, I certainly had verbal consent and repeatedly reminded them that their participation was voluntary. And then reciprocity through service is very important. I will add, and you'll see that in my proposed solution of how I'm involved directly in reciprocity through service. I apologize for getting a little nervous at this point because I'm about to share something publicly that I've never said in public. I've only said privately. So you'll notice appropriate disclosure and bracketing is highlighted. And it's important that you, as well as my participants, all knew that I myself was a foster kid. I went into foster kid at the age of 7, and I was emancipated when I was a sophomore at Georgetown University, which is quite a story in itself. I had 9 different placements. When I was, the summer before my junior year of high school, I was actually in a shelter. And it just so happened that the gentleman I call my father, 90-year-old Norman Hatfield, with whom we celebrated Father's Day yesterday, he at that time was on the Child Welfare Board of the county where I lived. He went to his church and he and my mother, Nancy, tried to get some family there to take me on. It was the kind of thing I had been the president of student council, I was doing well in school, I was living in a shelter. It's not exactly the picture we think of. So, but when we got no takers, they had me come live with them. Ironically, I only lived with them an actual year because I did a study abroad experience in Brazil, which I think was part of what helped me be successful because I no longer had to explain to everybody, I have a different last name. I was just the gringo American who happened to speak Portuguese. It is important to share, however, that when I did go abroad, they actually had to find my birth father because the Brazilian consular officials would not let my foster guardians approve my studying abroad. So in my old passport, it actually says Viajo com permisso do pai, which means travels with permission of his father, and I actually have the signature of William Edward Ebersole, whom I had not seen in many, many years since I was a small boy. So that's a little bit of my story. Obviously, I'm sharing that with you because you understand why I'm here today. I didn't go into quite that detail with my participants, but it was important, and it certainly was helpful for me to then, for them to feel comfortable in sharing the story because I wasn't looking at them, I was with them as they were talking to me. Again, data analysis, obviously very important, and I can't say enough about this related to this particular study. A constant comparative analysis. From that evening when I met Hannah in a coffee shop, I listened to her very carefully, and I very carefully coded immediately what she said. And that was sort of the gateway from which I began to understand. So repeatedly, I went through initial coding. I did the gerunds, again, actions, ing words. Thank you, Kathy Sharma. I did that over and over again. I did go through focus coding. And again, it's very true. Memorizing is a big deal. These two folks have taught me. They know I get quite elaborate when I'm writing, but I do a lot of writing. And so I would, as she said, it was the core of the grounded theory was all of these memos I collected. In terms of validation strategies, I did do memory checking. I would have some of the participants actually review the transcripts to make sure there was accuracy whenever I had a question. Again, back to this being my elaborator self, often rich, thick descriptions. Again, Dr. Gabbard and Dr. Brock have read my dissertation, so they know how I get a little into the descriptor of it. And then obviously peer review. I had two friends, actually colleagues, one with a PhD, one with an EDD, who did actually read my work and just comment generally. And then most important of all, again, with my modest little grounded theory study, and I do want to say a modest grounded theory study, it is a small contribution to the literature, but this idea of saturation of the data. It's very important to know that as Sharma defined, that when sampling no longer reveals insights or properties, and it's important to say that all of my theoretical categories have multiple dimensions to them, but when that ceases to happen, then we've achieved saturation. And again, I will say from the beginning with Hannah through to the end with Natalie, they were very consistent. They sort of echoed one another. And finally, when talking with Natalie, who was the final participant, that interview really didn't reveal any new information or properties. So we knew we had, again, with great difficulty, finally reached saturation. Here is the coding system. You'll notice that the 25 codes were eventually translated into these greater abstraction on the theoretical categories. Again, reflection, relationship, resilience, responsibility. And here, alas, is the theoretical framework for successfully aging out of foster care in West Virginia. You'll notice there are 5 categories. It's very important to understand that it is not sequential, not like the board back there. Again, they can happen at any time. You'll notice that they are multidimensional. It's also very important to understand that, yes, resurgence can often be sort of the culminating piece, but it can happen as well at any time. It is a significant one, but they're all of the same weight because all of these have to be present. In fact, those dimensions have to be present for that particular category to be true. And I would just use the example of resurgence because that's, again, something that is kind of important to the study. It's that again, we as foster children, certainly just in my study, we sort of come to terms with our parents and relatives. And that means we accept, and you'll see vivid examples of this in just a moment. By accepting that, we learn to advocate for ourselves. We no longer expect our parents to do that for us, which then allows us to then begin advocating for others. And what that is very important about this is that children in foster care are no longer victims. They're no longer inadequate people, but they are indeed young men and women who have agency and are therefore able to make a contribution. That's a really big idea to success. So I'll just go briefly through these with you. Most importantly, this idea of developing capacity for self-reflection and love. And again, Natalie said it so beautifully. Self-love is key. I guess I learned it actually when I had my daughter. Remember, she was a teen parent. Or a year or so into me having my daughter. And I think that was my first time realizing what love truly was because I love her. Then I realized I could never be successful for her if I didn't love myself. And no one had taught me that along the way because I don't think anyone had loved me. I mean, my sister did, but like a sister, I guess learning to love myself has actually been the biggest key to making it through college these last few years. She's actually now a college student. Another part is this idea related to relationships specifically is to create and sustain meaningful relationships. You have to understand that with multiple placements, it's very difficult to maintain any kind of relationship, whether a friendship, a family member, very difficult. And so therefore, folks who successfully age out of foster care learn how to recreate them for themselves. And again, these are traumatic. Imagine the breaking apart of a family. As Wyatt described, actually Wyatt is a former Marine. He spoke to me and said, when we were taken away, they didn't really explain anything to us. A couple police officers came up to our door, one social worker, and all she said was, pack your bags, you're going. then the most specific thing I can remember is us all lining up, all 9 of us, one by one, people coming to take us away. We split up. We were all split up. I must confess to you that none of my participants did not cry over the course of the interview. Every participant cried at some point, as did Wyatt when he shared this story with me. Again, another facet of relationship is rebuilding emotional trust, not only the relationship itself, but the trust that is involved. So how do you begin to trust adults? And then Kayla told a very interesting story about her learning to trust her social worker. And I won't read the entire thing, but I think the important part is this, is that the social worker sat down and was like, you are not going to treat my child like this, referring to an adult who was unkind. She said, the staff person apologized, was very apologetic, and we moved on. My social worker looked at me after the staff person left. She's like, you are not going to be a little, again, you are going to act like a person. Seeing her stand up for me and seeing that there was somebody on my side made me want to be better. Again, that's a true, authentic connection. The ability for her to, one, trust the social worker, to have someone truly advocate her, and for her to feel that in a way that actually made her want to change her behavior to a significant dimension of success related to relationship. Resilience. Again, the important part here is this, again, the constant bombardment of multiple placements, leaving one's family, and how they adjust and then tolerate this ambiguity. Again, most importantly, not only about uncertain outcomes, but that their agency isn't respected. The fact that they're told to move, and they don't just say, where are we going, why are we going, you just have to go. And it's often not explained. And as Wyatt said, and this is a very powerful statement, I would say that the foster families did more abuse than what our parents would ever do. We often think that the trauma exists only in the birth family, and yet these children repeatedly experience trauma at the hands of their caregivers. That came through very loud and clear, and therefore folks who are successful in aging out develop resilience related to that. Again, and you'll see here, and this is a very hard statement to read. Again, for someone who does not have what we call a high ACE score, again, which again, adverse childhood experience scores, right? You're familiar with that literature, perhaps. It's a little complicated to hear her say that sexual abuse was not as difficult as emotional abuse, which is just boggles the mind. I'll just read what she said. I was in a lot of really bad homes, and I don't know how it happened so much. Statistically, it makes no sense, but it just did. And I was just unfortunate. So I didn't really have any preparation. In the beginning, the first few were sexual abuse. And then after that, it was physical abuse. And then the last ones were emotional abuse, which somehow were worse than the first ones. Responsibility is a very interesting dynamic. Sort of as like a bit of a double-edged sword. All of the participants were treated as unpaid babysitters. And that actually impeded their actually being a family member because they were almost treated like employees of a sort. And yet, conversely, their relationship to younger siblings and younger children allowed them to be self-responsible in this instance where, again, Wyatt, he talked about the temptation to run away, but said, I thought about it, but never put into action. I had younger siblings. He had to set an example. Again, Natalie also said, I think it was my little sister. I kind of always had to be strong for somebody. I don't know. I think that played a big idea, this idea of being responsible for siblings. An example of resurgence, again, coming to terms with our parents and then reclaiming our sense of agency as part of that traumatic experience, recovery. Again, she did, Ashley in this instance describes her mother who was stage 4 bipolar, who left the family without food. And then she says, I wasn't going to be paycheck to paycheck like my parents. I was going to be able to feed my kids. I wanted options. I wanted to be a successful woman. So again, coming to terms with the deficient care on the part of her mother due to her mother's mental illness, inspiring her to be successful. Another example here of sort of outward advocacy. We have a young woman, Kayla, who describes the experience of how we need to change the system related to the guardian ad litem. The guardian ad litem, as she explains, they put all the weight in the guardian ad litem. That's the court-appointed official who's there to advocate for the child. In this instance, she says that person needs to give a damn. That is the person the judge relies on. The judges only hear what's told to them. She goes on to say, they rely on the guardian who has never met the child. My guardian met me twice. That's because I went to court twice. He talked to me a couple minutes before then. He mumbled some words to me that I couldn't tell you what he said. We went into the courtroom. He did not do squat. And so again, she took that advocacy not only for herself, but saying we need to change the system. So quickly, to bridge then from the findings to the solution, here are my leadership things. I noticed they're all around the doorways here as well. But again, strategic connectedness, relator responsibility, individualization, which in short means that I'm aware that I'm a system thinker who understands that change happens through individuals in relationship who have some level of personal contribution to make. So therefore, when I was thinking about how can the application of the framework best respond to the crisis affecting child welfare, I knew that I wanted it to be something that provided direct services to the children, to these young adults, and preparing them. And I had specific ideas related to the theoretical categories to offer them guided practices, a sense of belonging, and the experience of their own opportunity for advocacy and community action. Another key part of this, given our Creighton program and the Jesuit ideal, I thought it was important to involve the system leaders in the actual development of my proposed solution that I'm going to share with you in a second, and that they would actually help not only identify candidates for an application process, but they would be involved directly in developing the curriculum that's part of the solution. They are indeed the agents of change and therefore responsibility for accountability for taking action, because right now, certainly in West Virginia, there's a bit of stymied action. No one knows what to do. We, for example, a number of our children are actually exported to other states like Ohio and Kentucky, even New York and Florida, because we don't have places to house the children. So again, my idea is to develop a Governor's Success Academy. There currently is a Governor's Schools of West Virginia. These are summer experiences for elite children. There are 4 of them. They relate to the arts, honors, STEM, these kind of ideas, entrepreneurship. The idea would have a summer experience for youth in foster care in grades 9 through 11 in West Virginia. So we would apply the framework through the system leaders, again, school counselors, social workers, peer mentors. I'm actually working with a circuit court judge who is helping me develop an advocacy curriculum, which is very interesting. It's very exciting, that work going on. And again, the accountability would also affect these agency leaders. And I used to work for the West Virginia Department of Education. I have very significant contacts as well with our Department of Health and Human Resources that would support the implementation through accountability. And the eventual outcome would be, again, to prepare our youth in foster care to age out successfully by creating community, having intentional practice in a safe space, while they themselves together learn to promote advocacy and community action. And this slide simply reviews that, a 3-week summer experience, and again, in providing direct services, reframing the purpose of foster care. I think that's a big idea. If I could show you here, that we move from simply providing shelter and sustenance, which is what the system does now, to actually promoting well-being and belonging among foster children. Implications of the study. Very important that system leaders reorient the task by giving voice to youth in foster care with decisions that affect their present and future lives. Again, thank you, Dr. Bloomquist, for alerting me to the idea of cultural humility rather than cultural competency. Ferranda and Baptiste have done, and others have done work related to this, but the idea that only those who have had this experience are truly the knowledge bearers and actually can best inform how to change and improve their own status. That's very important. Again, although it's a modest framework, as I say, there's not much literature on this, but the very idea that it's conceivable that the framework could apply to other contexts and communities. For example, there were no children of color in my study. Obviously, the participants in my study all were from rural communities as well, so how would it apply to an urban context? And then, perhaps most important from a Jesuit perspective, that idea that we learned again in the first course together, Dr. Brock, where Alauni told us that we're all leaders, right? We may not recognize that, but to truly recognize the leadership of children in foster care, of youth in foster care, that they can actually shape and contribute. Again, moving away from victimhood to actually being agents themselves who are able to contribute to their own change and society's change. In conclusion, again, those who've taught me know I love to quote Flannery O'Connor, but I will say, When I went to study abroad when I was a kid, first living with the Hatfields, they required that I write letters home to them. And I didn't really know what to do, so I read Habit of Being, and I took on Flannery O'Connor's voice. That's what I did. I would sort of ape her letters home, because I don't know if you're familiar with the text, but Habit of Being is the collected letters of Flannery O'Connor. But she said, I have to write to discover what I'm doing. And for me, from my own experience of foster care, it's so important that I constantly write, because yes, there would be times when I'd be triggered during these interview times, but I had to maintain my objectivity as a researcher. And part of how I did that was not by calling these two people as much as I wanted to. Sometimes I will admit I had a Sherpa who assisted me enormously, who I think Dr. Bloomquist knows something about, but also part of it was just writing it out, constantly writing out what I'm experiencing, so that I was then more able to fully engage with these brave young adults who were telling me through very intensive interviews. These were not like, so how are you doing? Please click A, B, or C. These are very intensive and passionate interviews. So I'm very grateful for that. Please, I apologize for the small print it is for you, but I'm so grateful to the people in the room who have participated in this. I'm grateful for so much that I'm here today. As Dr. Moss-Green told me, she taught me a phrase early on in the very first week, actually. She told me to be humbly proud. So I'm humbly proud to be here today and to acknowledge all those who have supported me along the way. Now your questions.
That's good. Would you like to start?
I would. Thanks, Lee. This was a nice presentation, interesting study, clearly a very important topic. Just a couple of comments. I thought you did a nice job of trying to, for lack of a better word, operationalize success. You know, success.
When I talked a lot about that.
Yeah, it's a tough concept. I guess a few things that I wanted to ask about as well. So for one, you know, just thinking about a constructivist grounded theory approach, as you alluded to, you know, it is intrinsically tied with promoting social justice. So, you know, to what extent can you leverage this to actually bring about change and a call for change?
I think, and that's what I'm just so grateful for, that I had an opportunity to do intellectual work, though, that I think really has, you know, sort of as Ignatius taught us, you know, our love must move from word to deed to action. And I'm excited about this Governor's Success Academy because it's just one of those things. I am very connected within the different communities. I will say, as part of this study, by doing this cross-training I did into child welfare, I got to know a lot of people in work in that field. They invited me, as Dr. Brock knows, to their annual meeting. I got to go there and speak with them about the study. But to really concretize that, because I do want the ideas to permeate, and I would do that when I've talked about possible publication, possible further presentations related to the work. So that's sort of the intellectual work, but more importantly, to truly develop the Governor's Success Academy and make it very tangible. So that's one of the reasons why I chose to house it. And I've already made contacts there at Shepherd University, which is actually in my hometown. It's one of our state universities. So it's very important that, so I can really operationalize and concretize it, make it happen. This is another odd little factoid, but it's very, very true, that the chair of both the House and Senate Education Committees actually live in my county. They're actually my representatives in the state legislature, and I've had conversations with the Senate Ed chair already about the possibilities. We would want it to be positively identified with the governor, so he would again make fiat, make it happen. It would allow funding to ensue, although we temporarily have private funding, as Dr. Brock, Dr. Newman know. I have a preliminary budget to pilot it as well. So lots of concrete stuff.
Good. To kind of go into just a few more research details, I'd like you to clarify. So for one, I guess what I'll start with, you know, in the peer review process, you said you had someone with a PhD in an ED review. Could you comment a little bit on the results of that peer review and anything that you did change or didn't change as a result of that?
I think, again, not so much with the methodology. I think you really anchored me with that. It was more in terms of the storytelling itself and related to those transitions. So I must admit it, sometimes I wanted it to be in their voice, And I did not want it, if you will, to, for lack of a better word, almost like objectify them. So one of my colleagues was very helpful in keeping it where we allowed them to truly be the subjects that they are in this work and allowed that work to speak. So as you know, we had to trim a few of them, but a lot of my finding section is really them talking and then me bridging in certain details so that the reader who's unfamiliar with foster care sort of understands the situation. So that's a key thing. I did have significant support from a dear friend who helped me with that work in particular. There was another colleague who actually, when you came back with me with the edits related to Chapter 5, I really met with her and went through the process of how you could really make it happen, and not just me. As you know, in my previous life, I was responsible for the revision of our educator evaluation system in the state. So I'm used to setting up task forces, a committee, and working through that process. But how do we make something like this happen, where I am not? Well, again, how do I become comfortable with talking more publicly about my identity in order to operationalize something? She helped me do that, but it really was a response to your edits to make sure that this thing could really happen. Because while I understand what I would do, how would someone reading my dissertation understand the cookbook of putting it together?
Thanks for clarifying that. One final point, I was just curious. So you mentioned the affective attachment and how that's been implicated and sort of the lack of educational outcomes, everything else considered. But I was wondering the extent to which that came out.
I do apologize. I said affective is actually avoidant attachment.
Okay, I was curious about that. All right.
It's I misspoke.
Lack of affective.
Did I say, yeah, the lack of affective. It's called avoidant attachment, which is almost like a misnomer. I do apologize. I said affective. I meant avoidant. That's the key. In other words, they truly do avoid attachment related to adult authority figures. And therefore, and I hate to say they, but we, again, have this kind of, well, you were on my committee. I kind of go it alone a little bit and then only ask for help when I really need to screech, that kind of thing. Yeah, and I do apologize. I said effective, I meant avoidant.
And did that come through in any of your interviews as well?
Yeah, I think two participants in particular, all of them, alluded to this kind of self-starterism. I think they were very much about, they didn't look to people to solve their problems. Hannah very early on talked about that. She told me a story about, say, her Christmas gift. She already bought it. She didn't expect some adult to provide that. If she wanted something, she had to do it, create it for herself. So it came often quite a bit in that they truly did avoid attachment, but very much were oriented toward achieving their own success constantly, which also has a bit of a downside as well, as you would understand, because then there is a bit of people pleasing, I guess, that goes on at the same time that they're trying to do the work, as I stand here and defend my dissertation. Yeah, because I'm sort of in it and out of it at the same time.
All right, I can yield for now.
I just, when you speak to, I think we all start off studies with something in the back of our minds we think probably is going to happen. Can you speak to the surprises that you had when you conducted this and talked to them?
The biggest thing is I really did think that there would be more, if you were part of the physical world that they would talk about. I thought they would talk about material things. I thought they would talk about, because I didn't have them perhaps, but how the financial aid supported their success, how these different opportunities, there would be tangible programs. Instead, they went on this kind of interior journey. It was about their interior lives, the self-reflection, the way that they learned to relate, the way they took that deep dive into themselves to be successful. I think that was the greatest surprise. I wasn't expecting it to be, if you will, an emotional, psychological journey. I was expecting it to be more about the material world and how, that they got job seeking advice, or that there was a school counselor who reached out to them. They didn't tell stories about that. It was mostly about their own interior work. That's what they talked about. I think that was the greatest surprise to me.
People have depth.
They gave a lot of depth, my own vulnerability allowed that, because I have to tell you, it's very awkward to be on a telephone with someone who's 40 years your junior and say, hello, and I want you to know that my experience is different. However, I was a foster kid at the time. I was trying to tell a story. Yeah.
Anybody else have a question?
I just had a couple of comments. That was very lovely. Thank you for your presentation, and you hit a lot of the things that I hope that our students will hit in a dissertation, talking about this idea of saturation and what it is and what it isn't, and not out kicking your findings. So I will miss having you in the program. I'm grateful that you're done for you, but this has been a joy to have you here, so thank you.
I will say that I'm grateful to my committee for really challenging me to talk about the saturation.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's important that you know, and you've hung a beautiful bell on the constructivist view, which is very appropriate, sounds like, for, you know, your,
Definitely my chance.
yeah. I also appreciated, the first note I made was thank you for operationalizing your terms, namely success. And I imagine that was a real challenge to figure out how you can actually measure, what can you measure? So can we come up with things that are measurable to determine what success is for purposes of this study? If you had your druthers and you don't have to worry about all of this, finding the people that you for sure knew met these criteria, how would you define success for folks that have been in similar situations? So if you did the study again, you didn't have to worry about all that technical crap. What's successful, and how would you talk to folks that have met that criteria? Would they be the same folks, different folks?
And I will say finding participants was the major challenge of this, because to be honest, the system loses them once they're gone.
Right.
How do you find them? So having people think about who were the recent people who left, that kind of thing. So that was a real challenge. To be honest, I think it is, again, not about that material world, but how they themselves, and I'm sure that there are, I'm not immediately familiar with them, but I'm sure there are scales and ways to understand how that they themselves have a sense of their true belonging of themselves, that own sense of agency, more of those kind of measures of success. How do they do that? How do they have their place in the world? I go back and back to this idea that, again, as you imagine, there's a great deal of prejudice. I will admit that coming into this room and saying, yes, I'm a doctoral candidate, but I'm also a foster kid, then you might be willing to think me, you know, emotionally disabled. You might think all sorts of things about me, and there are some of them that are true. That's the other hard part about it, but ultimately that sense of self and how we engage that, what are the measures we would use for that? Unless those are more difficult qualities, it was easier to do almost the tangible pieces. Yes, they have a job, yes, they have a house, yes, they're in education, that kind of thing.
And I think you just set up study two beautifully, right? Or not, which is all of these tangible things. You thought all of you may have believed that those tangible things are what might predict or meant the most to your participants, but they did not. And so then how might you study those things?
Exactly.
Yeah. Anyway, that was lovely. Thank you very much, Lee.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lee. Wow. Quite a journey, right?
Quite a journey.
I had similar experiences of great job on different areas, and starting with the operationalization of tests. And then I had a similar question as Dr. George's around, you know, now you come back around, it seems like your theme number two, the relationship, was a strong theme, and I wonder if you were to do it again, if you would say housing, employment, education, and healthy relationship as a marker of success. It came out, so it seemed fairly strongly. But your participants, single, I mean, young, I understand, single, divorced, one was married. Is there any, you know, because you said the avoidance attachment.
Thank you for that. Woo, big misnomer there, yeah.
Do you think,
Avoided attachment, not affected.
would you use something around relationship as a marker of success if you were to think about it?
Yes, because again, this actually came out in that very first text, and I'm sorry, I'm skipping on the title of it, the white book that you have us all read in the very beginning. Help me, Dr.
In the beginning of the program?
At the very beginning of the program, the white text.
Haslam?
Yeah, you're Haslam, thank you.
White tip.
Yeah, Haslam.
Psychology.
But again, that's the whole idea to it. There are these psychological dimensions, but the sociological dimensions, the social aspect of it. And again, yes, it is an interior journey, but the interior journey is only defined, again, sort of like with that idea of the advocacy. Yes, I learned to speak up for myself, but that doesn't, again, that becomes sort of self-centered and self-serving unless, again, almost from this Jesuit perspective, we reach out into the world just experienced true success. So I think you're absolutely right. Relationship is sort of a true test of, if you will, a well-developed interior self. That's important. And I apologize to Professor Hassler. I forgot the name.
It's okay, people.
I could see that that's what.
And it was because and I loved one of your takes on conclusions around shifting the purpose of foster care from the shelter and to sustenance to that promotion of well-being. And we need relationships. We are humans as social beings, right? And so thinking about one of the metrics of success being something around relationship, given the surprise that you had, not about the material things, it's about the journey of self through social interaction. The one other area that I was curious about, and it came, one of your participants said, successful woman.
Mm-hmm.
And you were researching with, but you only had one male participant. Do you think that after going through this, that you have a theoretical construction for women more than all foster children who age out?
And I certainly thought about that, because the ones who are willing, and in truth, I was only referred to Wyatt. He was the only male referral. As you can imagine, I won't say tons, but I had a significant number of referrals, but only that number that came through in the end. They were all women. And I'm not sure, but part of me thinks that the storytelling culture is more positively identified with women, and that they were more articulate and able. I will say that was the other thing that just blew me away, is that the fact that they had words and language to describe their experience over and over again. Where when I was going through this, I had no words to describe what I was experiencing. That may have something to do with my being a boy, a man. So I did think about time and time again, and again, how would it be different if there were more gender balance in it? Would that have shifted out the theory? Because again, if the stories were told, and that's the thing, if you read the actual dissertation, it's what these young women told me, and that comfort level they felt with me to just share their stories and have the words. It's just remarkable. I mean, that is the dissertation. Without their words, it's just me thinking about it as opposed to them telling their stories.
How many of your participants were mothers?
Only two. Actually, one was a teen mom, and then Kayla was also, she had 2 children.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's very interesting, isn't it? I think you did a great job.
It's really, really great presentation.
I learned a lot.
And your dissertation is an example of your finding of resurgence, is it not? I keep drawing that parallel, looking at it.
Thank you, because I do have to say, when you keep talking about all of these things, the goodness of this all did start with that qualitative, well, actually, it started a little earlier with you, Dr. Hitterman, but that ability to give me the permission, because as you know, at one time I was even thinking of sort of an autoethnography piece and going, that's not work for dissertation, but then to allow myself to be vulnerable and tell the story, especially in an academic setting, which you would well understand. And I know Dr. Brock has actually known this from early on, but it's not something I typically talk about, certainly not in a public setting. So I think that is part of my own resurgence. Yes, I will attest that. But this study, very important to say, right, Dr. Brock, this study is not about, and yet to have the permission to do a study that was about my own life was part of my story as well. Yeah.
I think it's important, because if I remember back, way back when I first met you, we had a conversation. And it was an issue for you. I think you just come full circle.
Well, again, there's a lot of shame in this, or at least for, again, I'm thinking about your TED Talk, actually, because I keep going about all of these generational differences that I think about. It was a different era, I guess, but I do think about a lot, that for me to stand in front of people whom I respect and say, you're not going to think less of me, the fact that I am a foster kid. I mean, I still have that identity, and yet I do, and that's the beauty of the thing that was kind of scary. As you're driving back, one of my participants, I traveled 5 hours to see her, and as I'm driving back, you're just like, it's amazing what you'll get if you do allow, and I know it sounds a little Brene Brown, but it's really true. If you're vulnerable and courageous, people can hear that, and they did. They opened up to me, and you see that in the dissertation
That's what you've done with it.
so far.
Positive outcome.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, very nice.
And I would be so brash to say that this is, so you just described your onlyness, right? Which is not a testable, foundational anything, but am I wrong? It sounds a lot like that spot in the world only you stand. You're the only person that could have done it in this way with that constructivist worldview. You're the only person. And so in many ways, you are the only qualified individual to have done this as it is.
Exactly.
My second is not all research is set up for popular culture type stuff. And if this is something that is fascinating and something you want to embrace that onlyness, this is TED Talk stuff, Lee.
Well, again, I attribute that to people
Well, it's an idea worth
who
putting.
encouraged me, though, to be brave, to do the work, because, yeah,
Yeah, so, I mean, not that I'm
thank you for that.
an N of one, but this is the kind of stuff that people need to hear. Nice work.
He is the only person who's done this.
And that way, with that lens, you're it.
And I was so excited when
You told me this
topic and that you had talked about it and that he was finally embracing all that, but.
It was hard.
That's the
Very
story.
beginning
That's
part.
the story.
Just to be frank, as you know, Dr. Brock and I are
It's, and you know,
educational leaders who have
it
been
should have.
easy to have done a study about principles.
Sure, I was so excited.
How very boring that would have been for you, right?
Oh, yes, I mean, this was so much more important. Yeah, I was so excited when I heard him say that.
Nice work.
Yes, very nice, thank you.
Thank you.
That's it, that's true of pleasure.
So is this where I exit?
Yes, this is where,
You
yeah.
exit.
Are you, do you have anybody on the phone?